A grandmother's journey to self-worth. At 61 years old, I never could have imagined that the most devastating moment of my entire life would unfold in front of complete strangers, in the grand lobby of an upscale resort. My daughter-in-law's voice rang out clear and cruel. "We've canceled the old woman's reservation. She can sleep in the garbage bin. It's exactly what she deserves." Laughter rippled through the crowd of onlookers as I stood frozen, feeling the weight of their judgment and amusement. But then I walked calmly to the reception desk and placed a distinctive gold card on the polished marble counter. When the general manager's eyes landed on me, his face drained of all color. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, his voice filled with reverence, "what an absolute honor to have you here. Share my story until the very end. And let me know which city you're reading from so I can see just how far these words have traveled." The journey begins. We had been on the road for nearly 4 hours. My son, David Thornton, gripped the steering wheel with focused determination while his wife, Fiona, occupied the passenger seat with her usual air of dissatisfaction. I found myself squeezed into the back seat alongside my 2 precious grandchildren, trying to make the best of an uncomfortable situation. For months, I had been anticipating this trip with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Ever since David casually mentioned during one of our infrequent phone conversations that they were planning a spring break getaway to Crestview Lodge, something inside my chest had sparked to life, a fragile hope that I should have immediately extinguished. Fiona had said there was space for me to join them. Well, what she actually said, in that particular tone I knew all too well, was, "I suppose your mother can tag along if she really insists on coming." Every syllable dripped with reluctance, transforming what should have been a warm invitation into a begrudging concession, another favor I apparently didn't deserve, but I accepted anyway. Of course I accepted. What grandmother wouldn't? Throughout the drive, Fiona maintained a steady stream of complaints about the traffic congestion, about the oppressive heat, about David's choice of radio station. When one of the children timidly asked if we could stop for a bathroom break, she released an exaggerated sigh as though she'd been asked to scale Mount Everest. "Just 30 more minutes," she snapped with visible irritation in her voice. David, as usual, said nothing. He never said anything when it mattered. He just drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I turned my attention to the window, watching the landscape blur past, desperately trying to summon excitement. I attempted to convince myself that this time would somehow be different, that maybe, just maybe, we could finally function as a genuine family for a few precious days. Arrival at Paradise Crestview Lodge materialized before us like something torn from the pages of a luxury travel magazine. Brilliant white stone walls gleamed in the sunlight, complemented by impeccably manicured gardens that looked as though each blade of grass had been individually placed. A massive fountain dominated the main entrance, its water dancing in elegant arcs. The parking area was filled with high-end vehicles, gleaming Mercedes-Benzes, sleek BMWs, and several cutting-edge Teslas. David maneuvered our modest sedan into a space among them, and for one brief, shining moment, I allowed myself to feel like I belonged to something truly special. We made our way toward the entrance, and the moment we stepped inside, the air conditioning hit me like a blessing after hours in the sweltering car. If the exterior had been impressive, the interior was absolutely breathtaking. Soaring ceilings stretched impossibly high overhead, supporting crystal chandeliers that cast dancing light across marble floors so perfectly polished you could see your own reflection gazing back at you. Elegant families formed orderly lines at the check-in counter. Staff members moved with practiced, silent efficiency, their movements choreographed like a well-rehearsed ballet. The soft murmur of refined conversations blended seamlessly, with gentle instrumental music drifting. From hidden speakers, I found myself lagging behind as David and Fiona approached the reception counter with confident strides. The children immediately broke free and ran toward a decorative fountain near the waiting area, their excited voices echoing off the marble. I clutched the handle of my small rolling suitcase, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place I must have looked in my simple floral dress and comfortable walking shoes. From my position a few steps back, I watched Fiona engage with the young receptionist, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a perfect professional bun. I observed as she checked something on her computer screen, saw Fiona nod her approval, watched David sign various papers with quick, efficient movements. Everything appeared perfectly normal, completely routine. Then Fiona turned to face me. The moment. Everything changed. There was a specific glint in her eyes that I recognized instantly. I'd seen it countless times before. It was the exact same look she always had right before delivering one of her supposedly innocent comments. The kind that sounded like harmless jokes to anyone else but left bruises on my heart that lasted for days, sometimes weeks. She approached me with slow, deliberate steps, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the marble floor with each measured stride. The lobby buzzed with activity, families patiently waiting their turn, employees efficiently carrying luggage, guests comfortably settled on plush leather sofas, absorbed in their phones or quiet conversations. And Fiona raised her voice. She didn't shout exactly, but she spoke with sufficient volume that every single head in that crowded lobby turned in our direction. Conversations died mid-sentence. Movement ceased. "We've canceled your room, Brenda." I froze completely, every muscle in my body going rigid. The words didn't make sense at first, bouncing off my brain without penetrating. I waited, desperately hoped for David to say something, to correct her, to explain there had been some terrible mistake. But he just stood there staring at the floor, hands buried deep in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. Fiona continued, her voice growing even louder, clearer, more deliberately cruel. "We're not going to waste our hard-earned money on a room for you. You can sleep in the garbage bin outside. It's exactly what you deserve after everything." Laughter erupted around me, not from everyone, thankfully, but from enough people that the sound felt deafening. An elderly man wearing an expensive cashmere sweater released a choked, uncomfortable chuckle. A younger woman leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand, and they both smiled with mean-spirited amusement. Even the receptionist glanced downward, visibly uncomfortable, as though witnessing family dysfunction was simply part of her job description. And my son, my only son, the child I had carried in my body, the baby I had fed in the middle of countless sleepless nights, the little boy I had held close when nightmares woke him crying. He laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was nervous, soft, barely audible. But I heard it as clearly as if he'd screamed it, and somehow that made it infinitely worse than any roar of mockery could have been. The children stood nearby, confusion written across their innocent faces. My 9-year-old grandson, Jake, looked directly at me with genuine concern. "Grandma, are you going to sleep in our room with us?" Fiona yanked his small arm roughly. "Quiet, sweetie. The adults are having a conversation." Rising from the ashes heat rose in my body, starting deep in my chest, then climbing steadily up my neck until it reached my cheeks. But it wasn't merely shame I felt. This was something far deeper, far more complex, an overwhelming mixture of profound humiliation, soul-crushing betrayal, and pain so sharp and intense I could barely draw breath. The chandelier light seemed suddenly too bright, almost blinding. The murmur of resumed conversations became a distant, meaningless buzz in my ears. My legs trembled uncontrollably beneath me. For one terrible second, I genuinely considered simply turning around and walking out. Just leaving. Calling a taxi, heading to the bus station, disappearing completely from their lives the way they so clearly wanted me to. But something fundamental shifted inside me in that precise instant. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was something clearer, sharper. It was clarity. For years, 15 long years, I had tolerated Fiona's cutting comments, her petty cruelties, her convenient forgetfulness whenever it came to including me in family events. The Christmases where there mysteriously wasn't enough room in the car to pick me up. The children's birthday parties where invitations arrived exactly one day after the celebration had ended. My son, my David, never once said a single word in my defense, never stood up for me. He always discovered an excuse, manufactured a justification, found a way to minimize what his wife was doing, and I had allowed it. I had permitted this treatment to continue because they were my family, because I didn't want to create conflict, because I lived in constant fear of losing them entirely. But standing in that luxurious lobby, with strangers looking at me with a mixture of pity and amusement, something crystallized in my mind. I realized the truth with stunning, painful clarity. I had already lost them. Years ago, I drew a deep, steadying breath. My hands stopped their trembling. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle and walked directly toward the reception desk, with my back straight and my steps firm. Even though internally I felt like I was completely crumbling to pieces. The receptionist watched my approach with an expression of cautious concern. "Ma'am, is there something I can help you with?" From my handbag, I extracted a very particular card. This wasn't an ordinary credit card. It had substantial weight to it, with a distinctive sheen that caught the lobby lights in a specific way. I placed it carefully on the smooth marble counter without uttering a single word. The receptionist picked it up, her fingers moving automatically. Her eyes went impossibly wide. She stared at the card, then at me, then back at the card again, as though she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid it through the card reader. "Mrs. Thornton," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her face had gone completely pale. We had absolutely no idea you were coming today. I apologize profusely. We had no record whatsoever of your arrival." Behind me, the silence was absolute, total, suffocating. I could physically feel the weight of dozens of stares drilling into my back, could sense the shift in atmosphere as curiosity replaced judgment. The receptionist's fingers flew across her keyboard with increasingly nervous movements. "One moment, please. I'm going to summon the general manager immediately." Recognition. And then he arrived with impressive speed. A distinguished man in an absolutely impeccable suit, his gray hair perfectly styled, came striding rapidly from a side office. His expression transformed instantly from professional, courtesy to something approaching, reverence the moment his eyes landed on me. "Mrs. Thornton." His voice resonated powerfully through the suddenly hushed lobby. He rushed toward me with obvious urgency. "We had absolutely no idea you would be gracing us with your presence today. Your name, of course, is prominently listed on our register of resort owners." The entire world seemed to stop rotating. Owners. I heard a choked gasp behind me. I knew exactly who it came from without needing to look. The manager, his name tag read Robert, continued speaking rapidly, but I could barely focus on his actual words. Something about the presidential suite, about special arrangements being made immediately, about how the entire staff was completely at my disposal for anything I might need. My heart pounded fiercely, not from nervousness anymore, but from a strange, complicated mixture of relief and sorrow that I couldn't quite process. I turned around slowly, deliberately taking my time. David stood there absolutely white, completely drained of color. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly like a fish out of water, as though he desperately wanted to speak, but the words were physically stuck in his throat, unable to escape. Fiona, on the other hand, had her face frozen in an expression of pure, undiluted shock. Her normally calculating green eyes now reflected something I had genuinely never seen in her before. Real, visceral fear. The children were pulling insistently on their father's sleeve, firing questions he couldn't possibly answer in his current state of shock. The people who had laughed just moments before were now watching us with awkward, uncomfortable curiosity. Some whispered urgently among themselves. Others simply stared openly, waiting with barely contained anticipation to see what would happen next. "Mrs. Thornton." Robert touched my arm gently, respectfully. "Shall we have your luggage taken to your suite immediately? We have champagne chilling on ice as we speak, and our chef can prepare absolutely anything you desire for dinner tonight." I nodded silently, still not quite trusting my own voice. "Perfect. And regarding your companions?" He glanced at David and Fiona with a carefully neutral, professional expression, but there was something unmistakable in his eyes. Recognition. He had witnessed the entire humiliating scene. They have their own separate reservation, I said finally, my voice emerging firmer and stronger than I had expected it to sound. They will not be traveling with me or staying in my suite. Robert nodded with understanding. Of course. If you need anything at all, anything whatsoever, simply dial 0 from your room phone. He gestured elegantly to a young bellhop standing at attention nearby. Please escort Mrs. Thornton to the presidential suite immediately. As the bellhop stepped forward to take my modest suitcase, David took a sudden step toward me. Mom, we need to talk. Right now. I looked at him. Really, truly looked at him for the first time in what felt like years. I saw a 37-year-old man standing before me, not the little boy he had once been. I noticed the lines beginning to form around his eyes, the gray threads starting to appear at his temples, the slightly hunched posture of someone carrying an invisible but substantial weight. But more than anything else, I saw a stranger. Someone who superficially resembled my son but had ceased to actually be him a very long time ago. Not now, David. But Mom, I don't understand any of this. How is this possible? Why didn't you ever tell us? Later, I said simply, and followed the bellhop toward the elevator bank. The presidential suite occupied the entire 15th floor. The bellhop made polite, professional conversation during the ride up, mentioning various amenities, restaurant hours, and the location of the spa. I nodded without really listening, my mind occupied elsewhere, lost in another time. When the suite door finally closed behind me with a soft click, I could breathe properly again for the first time in hours. The room was absolutely spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking mountain views that seemed to stretch into infinity. Elegant furniture was arranged with obvious care and taste. There was a full kitchen with top-of-the-line appliances, and even a beautiful baby grand piano positioned in one corner. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases throughout the space, their subtle fragrance perfuming the air. A bottle of champagne sat chilling on ice exactly as the manager had promised, and gourmet chocolates were artfully arranged on the coffee table. I collapsed onto the plush blue velvet sofa and closed my eyes, finally allowing myself to feel everything I'd been holding back. The hidden truth? The truth was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. 15 years ago, when my beloved husband Raymond Thornton passed away suddenly, he left me considerably more than anyone knew or suspected. Raymond had been a quiet, exceptionally hardworking man, the kind of person who could walk through a crowded room without drawing any attention whatsoever. We had lived modestly throughout our marriage, never showing off our success, never drawing unnecessary attention to ourselves. But Raymond had been remarkably intelligent about investments, extraordinarily smart. When he died, I discovered we had accumulated almost $2 million in various assets, multiple properties, diverse stocks, secure bonds. And this very resort, Crestview Lodge, had been one of his final, most ambitious investments. He had purchased a 30% ownership stake when the place was still under construction, betting confidently that it would become a successful luxury destination. He had been absolutely right. After his death, I faced numerous difficult decisions. David was 22 then, recently graduated from college, overflowing with ideas about how he should help me manage the complicated finances. Fiona, whom he had only been dating for 6 months at that point, was present for every single conversation, every family meeting, always offering her unsolicited suggestions. I remember one particular evening with painful clarity. We were sitting around the kitchen table in my old house, reviewing endless documents spread across the worn surface. David wore that serious expression he always adopted when he wanted to seem mature and adult-like. Mom, I really think you should let me handle all of this. It's incredibly complicated. I don't want you to stress yourself unnecessarily or make costly mistakes. Mistakes? As if 40 years of marriage and successfully running a household hadn't taught me anything substantial about managing money. Fiona sat beside him, nodding with an expression of exaggerated concern. It's an enormous amount to process, Brenda. David just wants to take proper care of you. Perhaps it would be better if he handled the accounts, manage the investments. You could simply relax and enjoy your fixed income without all this stress. Fixed income. As if I were some helpless old woman incapable of basic competence. But I nodded agreement. I let them believe they would be handling everything. I showed them a few carefully selected accounts, just enough documents to satisfy their curiosity and sense of importance. And I kept everything else, all the largest investments, the valuable properties, the business stakes including this resort, completely private. Why did I do this? At first, I genuinely didn't know. There was simply something about the way they spoke to me, the way they automatically assumed my incompetence, that triggered a protective instinct about what Raymond and I had carefully built together. Then, as months gradually turned into years, it evolved into something else entirely. It became a test, an experiment, if you will. I wanted to observe who they truly were when they believed I had nothing material to offer them except my mere presence. I wanted to discover if they loved me as their mother or merely tolerated me as a burdensome obligation. The answer revealed itself slowly, excruciatingly painfully. Years of exclusion. David and Fiona married 1 year after Raymond's death. They didn't request any financial assistance with the wedding. Fiona firmly stated that her parents would handle all arrangements. I assumed at the time that they wanted complete control over the details. Years later, a cousin casually mentioned in passing that Fiona had told people it wasn't worth asking Brenda for money because she barely had enough to survive on her fixed income. That fixed income, they had convinced themselves, was my entire financial situation. When the grandchildren were born, I tried desperately to be present and involved. I offered repeatedly to babysit, to help in any way possible, to be the grandmother I so desperately wanted to be. But there were always convenient excuses. Fiona was busy establishing her routine. The children had too many scheduled activities. It wasn't a good time for visitors. They invited me for Christmas, but always with that particular tone. I guess you can come if you don't have other plans. As if extending the invitation was a favor I should be grateful for. As if my presence was a burden they endured purely out of family duty. And the birthdays. Oh God, the birthdays. David never once forgot Fiona's special day. Always flowers, elegant, expensive dinners, thoughtful gifts. My 60th birthday last year passed without even a phone call. When I finally gathered the courage to call 3 days later, David said casually, "I'm so sorry, Mom. Work completely overwhelmed me, and it just slipped my mind." Fiona had thrown her own elaborate surprise party just 2 weeks earlier. 40 guests, live music, a magnificent 3-tiered cake. I hadn't been invited. I swallowed the pain again and again and again. But somewhere deep inside, a part of me was carefully registering every slight, every omission, every single time they deliberately chose to exclude me. And that part grew steadily stronger, solidifying into something cold and crystal clear. They weren't my family. They were my failed test, the dinner confrontation. The sweet phone rang insistently, pulling me from my painful thoughts. I ignored it. It rang 3 more times before finally stopping. Then my cell phone started vibrating persistently on the table beside me. David's name flashed on the screen. I ignored that call too. And the next one. And the next. Finally, a text message arrived. "Mom, please. We desperately need to talk. Fiona and I are waiting for you in the lobby restaurant." I stared at the message for a long time, watching the words blur slightly. Then slowly, deliberately, I typed my response. "Meet me in the restaurant at 7 p.m. Just you and Fiona. The children should stay with the hotel babysitting service." Dinner was scheduled in 2 hours. I took an extraordinarily long shower, letting the hot water gradually loosen all the tension that had accumulated in my shoulders over years. I put on a dress I had purchased months ago, but never found the courage to wear. An elegant deep navy blue with a flattering cut that looked better on me than I had remembered. I styled my hair carefully, applied subtle makeup. When I finally looked in the mirror, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. I saw a woman who didn't apologize for simply existing. I descended to the restaurant at exactly 7 o'clock. The establishment was beautiful, dimly lit with romantic ambiance. Candles flickering on every table, the gentle clinking of expensive glasses and quality silverware creating a sophisticated atmosphere. I spotted David and Fiona immediately at a corner table. David looked visibly agitated, nervously swirling his wine glass in repetitive circles. Fiona wore that expression I knew intimately well. Forced control, lips pressed into a tight line, hands positioned on the table with fingers interlocked far too tightly to appear natural. I sat across from them without uttering a single word of greeting. A waiter materialized immediately, filling my water glass and presenting the menu with practiced elegance. I ordered without even glancing at the options, keeping my eyes locked directly on my son. The silence stretched out between us, thick and suffocating with years of unspoken truths. Finally, David broke it. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" I took a slow sip of water before responding, choosing my words carefully. "Tell you what exactly? That I own a significant stake in this resort? That I have substantial money? All this time we genuinely thought you were barely surviving on Dad's fixed income." I never explicitly said that. I replied with deliberate calmness. "You simply assumed it." Fiona leaned forward aggressively, her voice controlled but obviously strained with barely contained emotion. "You made us look like complete fools out there in the lobby in front of all those people." I looked her straight in the eye. For the first time in 15 long years, I met her gaze without looking away, without backing down. "No," I said softly but firmly. "You made yourselves look exactly like what you truly are." Fiona physically recoiled as if I had actually slapped her across the face. David opened his mouth wide, but absolutely no sound emerged. The waiter arrived with our appetizers, placing them carefully before withdrawing quietly and professionally. No one touched their beautifully presented plate. "I don't understand any of this," David finally said, his voice trembling noticeably. "If you had money, if you had all of this wealth, why did you let us believe you were poor? Why did you let us think that I was a burden?" I finished for him calmly. I picked up my fork, cutting a piece of perfectly prepared salmon with precise, deliberate movements, because I wanted to observe something important. "See what exactly?" Fiona practically spat the words out with venomous anger. I chewed slowly, deliberately savoring the food they hadn't even touched yet. "I wanted to see if you loved me without expecting anything material in return. I wanted to know if I held any value to you beyond what I could potentially give you financially." David shook his head in apparent confusion and disbelief. "Mom, we've always loved you. Always." The words would have moved me deeply years ago. Now they just sounded completely hollow and meaningless. "Did you?" I asked softly, meeting his eyes. "Like when you excluded me from Christmas dinner 3 years ago because there supposedly wasn't enough room in the car." "I checked later, David. You rented a 7-passenger SUV and there were only 5 of you." David blinked rapidly. There was some misunderstanding with the rental company. "Or my 60th birthday last year," I continued, my voice still remarkably calm, almost conversational. "Not a single call, not even a text message. But 2 weeks before that, you spent $5,000 on Fiona's elaborate surprise party." "I called you afterward," David protested weakly. 3 days afterward, and only after I called you first," I said, taking another deliberate sip of wine. "And your excuse was that you were overwhelmed with work responsibilities." Fiona leaned forward menacingly, her eyes gleaming with barely contained fury. "This is absolutely ridiculous. You're acting like a resentful child, keeping meticulous score of every tiny mistake we've ever made." "Little mistake?" I repeated slowly, placing my fork down on the plate with a soft but definitive clink. "Fiona, in 15 years, you have invited me to your house exactly 11 times total." I had counted carefully. "And of those 11 visits, 6 were because you needed me to watch the kids while you went out for your own entertainment." "That's not fair," David protested. "We lead incredibly busy lives, Mom. We have enormous responsibilities." "I know," I nodded with complete understanding. "That's precisely why I never complained about it. That's why I always said yes immediately when you needed something from me. I watched the kids when they had that terrible flu, and you had your important business conference. Remember, David, I stayed awake for 3 straight nights taking care of them. When you finally came back, you didn't even ask how they were feeling. You just said thanks casually and went straight to bed. Silence returned heavily to the table. I could observe David processing this information, remembering. His face contracted painfully with each recovered memory. Or when your washing machine broke down, I continued, now looking directly at Fiona. I offered you money to repair it immediately. You told me you didn't need charity from anyone. But 2 weeks later, you asked David to buy you a brand new one. He withdrew $3,000 from his emergency fund. Fiona pressed her lips together tightly. We didn't know you could afford— Exactly, I interrupted firmly. You didn't know because you never bothered to ask. You automatically assumed I was poor, that I was a constant nuisance, that my only function in your lives was to be available whenever you needed me and to conveniently disappear whenever you didn't. David ran both hands through his hair roughly, a gesture he'd made since childhood whenever he felt completely overwhelmed. Mom, if you had just told us from the beginning— What? My voice rose for the first time, not dramatically, but enough that nearby tables turned to glance our way. I immediately lowered my tone. If I had told you I had substantial money, you would have treated me completely differently. Does that somehow make this situation better or worse? David couldn't answer. He simply stared at his untouched food. I took another measured sip of wine, feeling its warmth travel slowly down my throat. When your father died, you two visited my house every single week initially, remember? Helping me with endless paperwork, with bank calls, with everything. I paused significantly. But as soon as you thought everything was settled, as soon as you convinced yourselves I only had a basic fixed income and nothing more to offer materially, the visits spaced out dramatically. First every 2 weeks, then once monthly, then only major holidays, and eventually not even that. We had the kids to raise, Fiona protested defensively. We had our own life to build and maintain. I know. I nodded with complete understanding. And I never asked to be the absolute center of your life. I only asked not to be forgotten entirely. David took a deep, shaky breath, his eyes visibly watering. Mom, I didn't realize any of this. I had absolutely no idea you felt this way. I didn't look directly at him. Not once did you notice that your wife consistently spoke of me as if I were a burden. Not once did you wonder why your mother spent literally every single holiday completely alone. He fell silent, unable to formulate any defense. I looked at Fiona directly. Last Christmas, your sister posted pictures of your family dinner all over Facebook. I saw absolutely everyone there. 20 people gathered around that massive table. David's family, yours, friends, neighbors. I was a 15-minute drive away. I ate a turkey sandwich alone in front of the television. You told us you had other plans, Fiona said defensively. I lied, I stated simply, because I knew the invitation was extended purely out of obligation, not because you genuinely wanted me there. I placed my napkin deliberately on the table. And the truth, Fiona, is that I preferred being alone than enduring another dinner where you treated me like invisible furniture. That's completely unfair, she hissed angrily. I've always been nice to you. Nice? I let out a laugh completely devoid of humor. Fiona, you told your mother I was difficult to please. I heard you. I was in the bathroom at your house during Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. You two were in the kitchen talking. You said I was overly critical, impossibly demanding, that I always found something to complain about. Fiona's face paled slightly. I've never complained. Not about the food, not about how you raise your kids, not about anything whatsoever. But you needed to paint me as the villain to justify how cruelly you treated me. I stood up from the table. So no, I wasn't the one who made you look like fools this afternoon. You accomplished that entirely by yourselves. Wait, David stood up too, his chair scraping loudly. You can't just leave like this. We have to fix this somehow. There's nothing to fix, David. You showed me exactly who you are for 15 years and I've finally believed you. So what now? Fiona's voice climbed shrilly. Are you going to punish us? Disinherit us completely? Was this entire charade just to humiliate us? I looked at her with a complex mixture of pity and exhaustion. No, Fiona, I'm not going to punish you. I don't need to. You're already living with the natural consequences of your choices. I'm simply refusing to continue living with them myself. Mom, please. David caught up to me, gently grabbing my arm. His touch was soft, almost pleading. Give me just one chance to fix this. Please, just tell me what to do. I looked at him carefully. I saw genuine tears in his eyes. I saw what appeared to be authentic regret etched across his face. But I also saw something else that couldn't be ignored. I saw a 37-year-old man who had just realized his mother had money, substantial money, and that he had wasted years of potential benefits. I don't want you to fix anything, I said softly, carefully freeing my arm from his grasp. I just want you to leave me in peace. Establishing boundaries, I returned to my suite with a heavy heart, but an extraordinarily clear mind. The room phone started ringing again exactly 20 minutes later. I simply disconnected it. My cell phone vibrated constantly with incoming messages. I silenced them all without reading. I poured myself a generous glass of wine from the minibar and went out onto the spacious balcony. The nighttime view of the mountains was absolutely breathtaking. Flickering lights from distant homes dotted the darkness. Stars shone brilliantly in a perfectly clear sky. Cool air filled my lungs with refreshing clarity. For the first time in 15 long years, I felt genuinely light. The next morning, I went down to the restaurant early. I ordered a proper breakfast for myself. I enjoyed fresh, expertly brewed coffee and warm toast with homemade jam. I read the newspaper that an attentive employee courteously brought to my table. It was almost normal, almost peaceful, until David appeared. He looked absolutely terrible. Swollen eyes, wrinkled clothes, as if he hadn't slept at all. He sat across from me without asking permission. I didn't sleep even 1 minute all night, he said, his voice breaking noticeably. I've been thinking, remembering, and you're completely right, Mom, about absolutely everything. I continued eating my breakfast calmly. Fiona and I had a massive fight. She insists you're overreacting, that you're being manipulative, but He rubbed his hands roughly over his face. I started remembering specific things I had deliberately ignored, things I let slide because confronting Fiona was easier than dealing with them. He paused, gathering courage. I've been a terrible son. His voice cracked completely. The worst son imaginable. Yes, I said simply, without softening the truth. You have been. He seemed genuinely surprised by my blunt honesty. But David, I continued, carefully setting down my cup, I didn't come here seeking an apology. I didn't come here hoping you would finally see what you've done. I came because Fiona invited me, and foolishly I thought maybe things would be different. They can be, he said quickly, desperately. We can change. I can change. Why? I asked directly. Because now you know I have money? Because you realize there might be a substantial inheritance to lose? No, he protested, but doubt flickered obviously in his eyes. Because you're my mother. I've always been your mother, David. That fundamental fact didn't change yesterday. What changed was your perception of what I can potentially offer you. He remained silent, completely unable to deny this truth. I stood up from the table, leaving enough cash to cover the bill generously, even though I knew I didn't need to pay. I'm going home tomorrow. You can stay the rest of the week. Everything is paid for. Consider it my final gift as a mother. Final? His voice,